think of something that really matters to you that might be overwhelming, and just ask, how am I making this harder than it needs to be? That's it. That's like a magic question, because all that overcomplication, all that over-engineering, the overthinking, overexertion, all that over is actually going to get in your way. And it's because you're sort of caught in this old paradigm, this old mindset. And there is an alternative mindset. And that mindset is summarized in that one word, effortless. That's what I mean by the word. There's a different path, an easier, simpler, lighter, smarter approach. And you've got to learn how to find those and search for them, because they are key to breakthrough contribution without burning out.
I'm Srini Rao, and this is the Unmistakable Creative Podcast, where you get a window into the stories and insights of the most innovative and creative minds who've started movements, built thriving businesses, written best-selling books, and created insanely interesting art. For more, check out our 500-episode archive at unmistakablecreative.com. Greg, welcome to the Unmistakable Creative. Thanks so much for taking the time to join us.
It's so great to be with you. Thank you.
Yeah, so you're actually here for a second time, which says a whole hell of a lot about your first appearance. We had you when, I think, long after Essentialism was published, which is probably one of my favorite books. In fact, it's one of those books I think I keep within arm's reach all the time, because I thought the concepts were so vital to being productive in the world. And you have a new book out called Effortless, which we will talk about in great detail. But before we get into that, last time I asked you what your parents did for a living and how that influenced you. This time I want to start by asking you, what is one or two of the most important things that you learned from one or both of your parents that influenced and shaped who you've become and what you've ended up doing with your life?
Just talking to my dad just a couple of days ago, and he summarized something that I've watched him do all my life. And he had the phrase, and it was like, my job every day is to try to observe, then serve, and uplift. That was like the mantra. And the way it's manifest for him is quite, unique as he is. But as he's driving down the street, he'll always notice if someone's pulled over. He'll always observe if someone seems to have, some car problem. And he knows how to fix cars. He's capable in that way. But it's not just the capability; it's the awareness. And he'll pull over. And I've seen him do that so many times, and it continues to be a frequent. I would be surprised if it's not every week or multiple times a week even. And sometimes he can't help them, but sometimes most of the time he can. And there's something in that very simple orientation that is portable and relevant to me. And the idea of first observe, then serve. I think that of the two elements, my observation would be that people are more willing to do the second than the first. But as a result of that, they actually serve less than they're willing to, and are less effective in their service and contribution to others. Yeah. And so I think in that first principle of first observe, you could go quite deep in understanding that. At one level, it's just an awareness that you're not so focused on the things right in front of you that you don't notice people. But it can go much beyond that, where you start to listen deeply and care about people and understand what really is going on for them so that you can serve them in a highly effective way. So that's one principle that's relevant right now that I've learned from my father.
Why do you think it is that more people aren't like that in, the modern world? Because I think that, one, the observed part, it makes sense that people are not very observant, given that they move at like lightning pace and they're drowning in a sea of, information from every source imaginable. But then the other component of this is that, people often act out of self-interest. And I'm writing this like massive article on, what it takes to build an audience in 2021 and beyond. And one of the central themes of that article is that it has nothing to do with you. Nobody gives a damn about you. It's about what they want and what they need. But so many people are driven by self-interest.
Well, I mean, I can riff on that a second with you. I mean, I think it's pretty much the distinctive quality about what it means to be a professional in any field is your ability to observe deeply and precisely the needs and wants and unspoken needs and unspoken wants of the other. And so, if you go to the doctors and they don't take any time to diagnose you, how much will you trust the prescription? If you take your car into a garage and you don't trust that they have understood properly what's going on with your car, how likely are you to want to pay for what they're suggesting? It doesn't matter what field you're in. That's the distinguishing quality. How well can you identify precisely what is actually going on and what the need is? And so I think that it is a bit of a paradox, because to get somebody who is themselves self-interested to recognize why it is in their self-interest, to understand precisely what's in other people's self-interest, it is a mindset shift to recognize, to wake up and go, oh, maybe I've lived with an independent mindset in an interdependent reality.
Wow,
that's a big problem and a big opportunity. We've lived our whole lives as if it's like what I want, what I need to do, what I'm trying to achieve. And I think that that approach will take you a certain distance, just determination about what you want, just go after it. But what got you here won't get you there. So there's a big transition if you want to really move to, let's say, a 10x level of contribution and impact and influence. I mean, then it's all about your ability to understand others and to be able to put into words what they want. The great author is someone who doesn't begin with their own mind in mind, but begins with the reader's mind in mind, and that they see and understand and feel what that reader is experiencing and feeling, and can write to that. This is a big difference.
Tick tock, tick tock. Stop clock watching and put that curious mind to better use. ThoughtWorks is hiring for roles across the U.S. to help ignite the endless possibilities of tech. From senior and lead developers to data engineers, infrastructure consultants, and more. They're looking for talented technologists to join them in revolutionizing the tech industry. Make your mark. Learn more at thoughtworks.com/careers.
Is your prostate waking you up more often than your alarm clock? The fact is, the older you get, the more likely you'll have prostate problems, which can affect your everyday life. That's where Prostate Complete by Real Health comes in. Prostate Complete is the result of 20 years of experience as a leader in men's health. The powerful formula in Prostate Complete supports natural prostate function and reduced urinary urges for a better quality of life. Available at Walmart. Visit prostateoneperday.com for special offers. These statements have not been evaluated by the FDA. This product is not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease.
This episode of The Unmistakable Creative is supported by the Longtime Academy, a new podcast about how to be a good ancestor. It's a show about time and how we think about time. Short-term thinking can be really stressful, and some of us find it difficult to plan for tomorrow or next week, let alone next year or 10 years from now, and long-term thinking can help. If you've ever felt unproductive, exhausted, or worried about the future, or powerless to change the path our world is on, the Longtime Academy can help. You'll hear from people like Brian Eno, Celeste Headley, George the Poet, Roman Kurznerek, Jake Griffiths, and Adrienne Murray Brown, and learn how they embrace long-term thinking. The Longtime Academy is an audio documentary, but it also includes practical exercises designed to expand your sense of time and help you be a good ancestor. I got to check out an early episode of the Longtime Academy, and here's what I thought. Listening to the stories on the show causes you to reflect on the past, be more mindful about the present, and more deliberate about the future. So if you're sick of being overwhelmed by the day-to-day, always dwelling on the past, and always worried about what could go wrong in the future, listen to the Longtime Academy. Search for the Longtime Academy anywhere you listen to podcasts. We'll also include a link in the show notes. Life is short, time is long. The Longtime Academy. What role do you think that sort of the prevalence of social media, the internet, personal brands, all this stuff has played in our inability to observe? Because I think that we were talking about Adam Smith before we officially hit record here, and one of the things he says in the book, in The Wealth of Nations, is that self-interest is the engine of prosperity, which there is definitely a grain of truth to that. If we didn't have self-interest, people would just sit on their asses and not do anything all day. But then you kind of have the issue of self-interest pushed to the point of diminishing returns, which I think we've started to see the consequences of that, from organizational levels, individual levels in politics, and, damn near every other area of sort of the way society functions. To your point, people are largely driven by an independent mindset in an interdependent reality.
Yeah, I mean, look, the Wealth of Nations, that principle of self-interest driving, the invisible hand of the market is an accurate idea, but it comes with an assumption that life has a certain amount of virtue necessary. The great entrepreneur is still going to be the person who can anticipate the needs and desires of the customer better than they can. So it's not just, it is an oversimplification, even of the Wealth of Nations and his thinking, which of course is an oversimplification of the complexity of the world. But to say that it's only that, it's more like that principle. And I know you're saying this, I know you're in support of it. It's just, it's a little bit like that classic, quintessential idea in How to Win Friends and Influence People, where he says, you can achieve more by way of becoming interesting in conversation, by being interested, than in trying to get other people to be interested in you. And I think he says it more like, you'll achieve more in 30 minutes than you will in years of trying, if you shift that strategy. People will say, oh, he's such a great conversationalist because he's so interested in me. That's what they really are experiencing. And so similarly, if we really want, all the things we really want are on the other side of an interdependent mindset. Everything. You want meaning, you have to understand people that you're going to serve. There's no meaning outside of people and relationships. All purpose starts with service. All purpose starts with somebody else that you want to make a difference to, born or unborn. If you want money, well, you have to figure out what other people want. You aren't going to make it just because you happen to want wealth. You want love. You've got to understand what the people around you need so you can meet those needs so that they can feel love themselves and love in return, and so on and so on. I mean, there's just nothing that you want that you can actually sustainably get without understanding the interdependent reality, and that sort of relationship mindset, I think, changes everything. And in some ways, I think it shifts essentialism. There's like essentialism 1.0 and essentialism 2.0. Essentialism 1.0 is where you say, hey, what's essential to you, right? Okay, think about that. So if you don't prioritize your life, someone else will. And it's you don't want to give up your right to think independently and for yourself and so on. And there's a case to be made for that, because you don't want to live, in a dependently or in a codependent relationship with people. So there is a shift that's necessary here to take responsibility for prioritization. But 2.0 is where you start to go, okay, I think I know what is essential for me, what my objectives are. But what if I could discover what everybody else's disproportionately important, vital things are to them? They'll be different to the ones that are for me. They're going to be as unique as that person is. And if you can identify that precisely, then the world is yours. Because as Lao Tzu put it, something like, people are easy to move if you have what they want. And suddenly you will know what people want precisely. And then you can give a small amount of service in the precisely essential thing that somebody else wants, can feel for them like a massive deposit. It's like somehow investing $1 and getting $1,000 of value in the person that you're serving. Now think of what that the difference is. I'll give you one final metaphor on this. Just think of the times that you have given a gift to someone, and you could tell once they received it, they didn't want it. It isn't, they just didn't, it isn't what they really would have liked to have. Or vice versa. Think of a time when you've received a gift. Maybe it was expensive and it's not at all what you wanted, and how awful that moment is to not be known, to feel alone, more alone than if they hadn't given it to you. And that's what's happening all the time in interactions with other people, is that that people feel more lonely in our interactions together. If you can do something about that, if you can be the 1 in 1,000 who actually knows people, what they want and what they need, and precisely what's essential to them, it changes everything.
Yeah. So to go back to that whole idea of self-interest as the engine of prosperity, you made a really important point, which is the role that context plays, which is something that just has become more and more apparent to me over the better part of this last year, is that, context is incredibly important when it comes to prescriptive advice of any kind. And yet, I think particularly in the self-help world, or, in the world that you and I live in, people have a tendency to ignore context. The example I always come back to is people sell an online course or something like that. Like, I did this, this, and this, and, buy my course, you'll get my results. It's like, wait a minute. Like, there are all these variables that the person buying the course can't replicate that the person selling it happens to have as major advantages.
Yes.
Like, for example, if I started a podcasting course, right? I started 10 years before this thing became a massive cultural trend. There are a lot of very lucky variables, unless somebody has a time machine, that they could never replicate in my story.
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely right. There's certainly, the word, one of the words that comes to mind as you're sharing that is just relevancy. If there's so much irrelevant sales copy, there's so much irrelevant content in the world, there's so much irrelevant posts, there's so many irrelevant things that people are saying, and of course that's waste for everybody involved, right? Irrelevance means that the person sharing is going to be ignored, and the person receiving feels, that it was a waste of their time too. It was useless. So that's the failed market of ideas. Yeah. If what we're trying to do is to find what it is that they really, what is it I have uniquely that they uniquely want and need. And I think, again, the biggest error is not even taking the time to identify, who am I writing to? Who is this for, really? Not just a word, well, people age this to this, not just a demographic, but like what's going on in their world? What's their pain? What's their felt pain right now? What's the complexity of their life? What do they want really? What's a tangible promise that has relevance right now that will stop them in their tracks in their busy lives? Oh, yes, I need this, an almost physical reaction. That's what you're trying to do. I mean, certainly, I think in the work that I'm trying to do in writing, I am looking, whether I'm successful or not is to be determined. But but it's to try to work out where is somebody at right now, and therefore which ideas have the most power of relevancy. That's to me the connective tissue that the many of the books that are published, I think that's really what they fail in. They're not failing whether they write about something that is good or something that is true. Most, I think, these books that are written are true or good in some way, but they just aren't. They just have not bridged the gap to make sure that the way they're writing it is highly relevant to the person reading.
Yeah. Well, speaking of relevance, I think that makes a perfect segue into talking about Effortless in particular. So, it's been a while since you published Essentialism, right? Probably the better part of 6 years, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
So
amazing, really, when you think about it, how quickly it all goes.
Yeah, I mean, I was very, very thrilled when I saw that you had a new book out. I think I ordered it the second I saw it was on Amazon. I was like, oh, Greg McKeown has a new book out? Essentialism was fantastic. So what is it that led to this book? And, why this? And then, how did you end up, deciding on this as the next sort of natural follow-up to Essentialism?
Well, I mean, let me answer that in two ways, if you don't mind. Let me answer it with first, given what we've just talked about, why I think this has relevance for people right now, and then I'm happy to share sort of my backstory to it as well. The why I think this is relevant for other people is that there's sort of two questions. Everybody listening to this, if we had them all, if we were all together in a room, and I say to all of you together, if I say, okay, put your hands up, if you would like to get better results, even 10x results, right? 10 times better. Every hand's going to go up. Now, if I ask a second question, if I say, okay, by a show of hands, how many of you can work 10x harder? You're going to have either no hands or sort of one or two hands, and then the book's not for them, right? Like if you can work 10 times harder, well, you're going to have a lot of value by working a little harder. You will get better results. You work a bit harder. You'll get that. That's great. I'm a virtue. Hard work is a virtue. Problem is, it's just not infinitely scalable principle. If you want to get 10 times better results, you have sort of one of two paths ahead of you. Either you can't do it, so you give up. So now you've got essential things you'd really like to achieve, contributions you really like to make, and you just go, no, that's not possible. That's one option. Second option is that you say, well, the only way to do it is work harder, even though I can't work any harder, so I'll try anyway, and then that's a recipe for burnout. And broadly speaking, I think that the second path is what people choose to do. Maybe they jump back and forth between the two in a kind of boom and bust execution strategy. Okay, I'll push harder. Oh, I can't do it. I'm exhausted. I'm burned out. And then they don't for a while, and then they try again when they're inspired to do it by someone or some circumstance. And I think, broadly speaking, there are probably only two kinds of people in the world right now. There are people who are burned out, and there are people who know they are burned out. And and so that's like that's sort of a setup of the problem. And now let me just share, before I get to the solution, let me just share sort of the backstory for why I personally came to this. And, it's a multifaceted experience, right? One thing, essentialism became a big success. So, traveling with that, in addition to being, what you might say the father of essentialism, I now am the father of 4 children. So there's all the responsibilities with that. I'm being more selective than I've ever been, but I still found myself just, running out of space. I want to make a higher contribution, just as I've just described for others that they feel this. I felt it too, but there's no more space. There's not 10x. I can't work 10x harder. And then in the midst of that, we have a family emergency where one of my daughters, she went from sort of a picture of health, outgoing, vivacious, funny, can't even stay mad, always climbing trees, running barefoot everywhere, naming our chickens. We have chickens, and all of that to then suddenly a massive decline inexplicably in her health, her mental capacities. Sort of imagine a Parkinson's disease type symptoms. We're visiting lots of neurologists, and nobody can even give us the faintest idea of why. All the tests are coming back in the normal range, and this is going on for several months. And so, once you suddenly add that to something that already there's no space in it, well, I found myself in the position that I just described. Do you give up on what's essential? Do you burn yourself out trying to pursue what's essential? Or what? And fortunately, I mean, it came through this exquisite, challenge, a trial, but what came of it was a very clear understanding that there was an alternative path. That when you can't work harder, or I'll say it differently, actually. When you're facing the hardest, most important challenges of your life, don't make it harder than it needs to be. There may be things that are making life. In fact, that's a good question just to put to people listening to this. It's like, think of something that really matters to you that might be overwhelming, and just ask, how am I making this harder than it needs to be? That's it. That's like a magic question. Because all that overcomplication, all that over-engineering, the overthinking, overexertion, all that over is actually going to get in your way. And it's because you're sort of caught in this old paradigm, this old mindset. And there is an alternative mindset. And that mindset is summarized in that one word, effortless. That's what I mean by the word. There's a different path, an easier, simpler, lighter, smarter approach, and you've got to learn how to find those and search for them because they are key to breakthrough contribution without burning out.
Even though my family's filled with amazing cooks, me being in the kitchen is basically a fire hazard waiting to happen, but I still want to eat healthy. And if you want to eat healthier and feel your best, then listen up. This is hands down one of the easiest ways. I've been drinking something called cachava as my breakfast to fuel my day. And it keeps me full for hours, and it takes less than a minute to make, which is pretty awesome. So what is it? It's been called the cleanest, most nutrient-dense meal imaginable, and I describe it as the best protein, vitamins, and everything you need to eat healthy all in one shake. It's loaded with over 70 superfoods and nutrients like maca root, chia seeds, sachaini, makai berry, acai, and coconut, and it actually tastes really good. The people who built this company started in the jungle on the side of a mountain during a health retreat, and their mission is to bring the world's best superfoods into a single, ready-to-go meal to help busy people stay healthy on the go. And Kachava is offering 10% off for the listeners of our podcast. Just go to kachava.com/creative. Again, that's Kachava, kachava.com/creative for 10% off. If you like The Unmistakable Creative, there's a new podcast I want to tell you about that I think you'll really like. On the Stories of Impact podcast, they go into the science behind innovative tools that help human beings flourish. The birthright of every human being is not just to survive, but to thrive. Hear about the intersection of the science and spiritual practices that give life the deepest meaning and fulfillment. Hear from Deepak Chopra, Laurie Santos, and more. The award-winning Stories of Impacts podcast returns for its 5th season. This acclaimed podcast features award-winning veteran journalist Richard Sergey and acclaimed writer and producer Tavia Gilbert. Find them wherever you get your podcast. The Stories of Impact podcast is supported by Templeton World Charity Foundation.
Yeah. It's kind of funny. It reminds me of a story, which I may have shared on the show before. I had a friend, this was, back in the early, probably 2000s, maybe late 90s. This is when, streaming to the internet wasn't as common as it is today. And he was working at Oracle as an MIT engineer, really, really smart guy. I go over to his house and like, what are you working on? He's like, well, I think he worked on RFID technology. And he had figured out that he said, I'm trying to basically set up my computer so that, when I'm watching movies that I've downloaded, I can watch them on my TV without having to go back into the bedroom where the computer is at. So I'm building this RF remote and, spending all this time. And I looked at him and I was like, why don't you just use a wireless mouse? And he looked at me. He was like, yeah, I guess I could do that, huh?
Well, exactly. In tiny and big ways. We we can apply the question. I was working with somebody who's a classic quintessential overachiever. She's the kind of person who, she's up till 4 a.m, photoshopping for her church youth activity the next day. No one's expecting or asking that from her, but that's just sort of how she thinks. If I'm going to make it, if I want to serve more, if I want to serve at a higher level, I must sacrifice more and more sleep, more of me. She feels guilty if she even eats lunch. And I said, look, you've got to invert the mindset. Everything you've learned just about performance and achievement has got you to this point. But in order to go to the whole next level, you've got to unlearn it all, invert the whole thing. The next time someone asks you to do something, don't say, well, how can I, I won't say not to ask. Ask, how can I make this simpler, easier? How am I making this harder than it needs to be? So she gets a call. She works at a university. She gets a call from a professor, says, I would like you to record my, video my class this semester. And she is just ready, wired to jump in this, 2 feet in. I'm going to wow him. What that meant to her was, well, we'll get my whole team there. A team of videographers. We'll have different camera people. We'll edit it together. All this. And music, intros and outros. We'll have graphics. I mean, we're just going to make it, special. And then she remembers, well, how am I making this more complicated, more difficult, harder than it needs to be? And so she pauses on that for a moment. She asks him, okay, well, tell me a little more about this. Like, who's this actually for? And what would it done look like for this, for you? And well, it turns out that this is for one student who's going to miss a few classes because of an athletic commitment. So the solution they come up with is that someone else in the class will just record it on, just on the iPhone and just send it to him wherever he's going to miss. And that's it. That's the whole solution. 10-minute phone call saves 4 months for an entire team. She can hardly believe it. That's when she sort of became converted to this idea of invert. Ask a different question. Look out of the different mindset. There's a Puritan ethic within many of us that says not only that hard work is a virtue, but that it is to be distrusted. And when we distrust it, what we're doing now, sometimes easy is wrong. I mean, I'm not saying always easy is the right, virtuous, good, solid path. But if we say it always is, that it means that all of those strategies, tools, options, tactics, that would make something simpler and easier, we just are like, well, we don't even look at those. We don't examine them, explore them. What a massive strategic error of judgment. And so I'm just trying to say, look, add it to the range. She would never have discovered it without asking a different question. Invert the question. That's one of the most practical things we can do to start moving into this effortless mindset.
So, I wonder what role our sort of media narratives play in all of this. And we had Justine Musk's here, Elon's ex-wife. And I think one of the things that you see, right, is when people see people like Elon, they think, if he works 120 hours a week, I should do the same, and then I'm going to become him. Again, we go back to context. And I think the thing that really struck me out of all the things she said is that people don't see the amount of work that goes into these kinds of accomplishments. She's like, it's an extreme way of living, and often, comes at the cost of a lot of other things in your life. And I don't think a lot of people are aware of the reality of that. And then, I think when Michael Shine here was telling us, like, Gary Vee is out telling people tweet from the toilet 200 times a day, so like, how do you begin to sort of unwind from, this cultural narrative that we perpetuate through iconic figures? Because they're the ones who have books written about them. They're the ones on the covers of magazines. They're the ones who are giving TED Talks.
Yeah. A lot of this is wrong. It's just because something makes it as a media story doesn't make it accurate, doesn't make it the true narrative. In fact, there's tremendous bias that is difficult to overcome because you don't write a story about someone who's just steadily working today, is working on something today and working on it tomorrow. It's not a story. There's no story to tell. And yet, in many of the stories that eventually do get told, that's actually the backstory. So that doesn't get covered in the story because you only become aware of somebody when suddenly something happens. And most progress is slowly, then suddenly. And so even where someone's story was about steady and effortless pace of continual steadiness over time, that isn't going to get told. You want the dramatic if you're trying to grab people's attention in news articles, and then of course this identifies which books get told, and so I just think that it's somewhat like a parallel to bloodletting. Just because the medical profession for the longest time were thought that the problem was in the blood. Much of disease was in the blood, and so your job was to drain people of blood using literally leeches. I mean, it's so medieval. But that was dominant mindset. And if you'd lived at that time and read the media stories and the books at that time, that's what you'd have been taught. And that doesn't... None of all of that, those articles or books or stories or the medical professionals of the time, none of that would have made it true. None of that made bloodletting right. It just meant that was the narrative everyone was learning from. And so similarly, we have this very outdated paradigm, this outdated narrative about what leads to superb performance, superb achievement. And lots of what's in that narrative is just wrong. And I don't know how else to say it but that. And we've known for at least the last 20 years in peak performance in athletic performance that there's all sorts of smart ways about how to help people operate at that level. And it doesn't look like no pain, no gain as we grew up hearing about. That's just, no pain, no gain. It's just a great example of performance bloodletting. Actually, what you want is to find a pace that you can sustain, so that you don't train, for example, in boom and bust cycles. You don't want to be pushing yourself to such a limit that you're aching and sore and don't go and work out for days or weeks, or you just give up for a while. It's too much. You want slow and small and steady and simple, and get better bit by bit. So that eventually leads to, your own breakthroughs. But of course, so I think that's something that's helpful to remember. A lot of these caricatures in the media, if you go back and double click on their story, is very different. Thomas Edison is the kind of part of the quintessential American archetype of what it is to be successful and what it takes. But if you go back I remember 20 plus years ago going to the home that he lived in Florida next to Ford had built a house, and they both built houses next to each other so that they could spend time together. And among other things, in the studio where Edison worked on, the famous light bulb, there's a bed right there. He would take naps in the bed, in the room where that was done. So he would work and he would sleep, and then when he had ideas, he'd wake up and work and go back to sleep. And he's sleeping constantly. He didn't believe, for example, in straining the body. He himself actually was quite extreme this way. He wouldn't run even. He just thought, your body's just there to kind of get your brain around. And so he wasn't draining himself to exhaustion in some extreme fashion in the way that maybe the narrative would be. So we got to go past those surface and outdated narratives to find what really works.
So one of the things I think I've always loved about your books is that you seem to frame them in these very clearly defined mental models, in which I could literally summarize your book, by reading out the 7 sort of key headlines from each one. And I think that's why I loved Essentialism so much, because it was just like, oh, wow. So this is just a personal question, a morbid curiosity. Like, how do you develop these sort of mental models and frameworks that end up becoming the content? And then we'll get into, the sort of what I literally have written down is sort of the 7 parts of effortless action.
Yeah, I mean, that's a nice question. I think a lot about them. That's for a start. I'm drawn for reasons I can't quite explain to clarity. You know, I care about clarity, and I seek it in conversation, and I seek it in the world around me, and I don't feel fully satisfied until I've sort of wrestled down and got to the other side of complexity and gone, okay, that's what it is, and I can name it. I feel satisfied in being able to name a phenomenon, and by naming a phenomenon, I also mean being able to identify clearly from what to what. You know, that's important. There's many books that write about what to do, but they aren't as good at clearly delineating what not to do. And it's in the what not to do column that we actually need to, like, that's where we, as a reader, can say, oh, yeah, well, guilty of that, guilty of that, guilty of that. Yeah, that's where my world is, you know, and that's what you have to have, that moment as a learner, as a reader, to be able to go, okay, got it. I'm now here. So what's now this book going to help me to get to from, and what got me here won't get me to there. What's the gap? And so, I mean, I'm working on a new book, and in that book, I'm constantly thinking about this, about where are people now? What's their, you know, I know what I'm trying to teach them to do, but where are they? If I can't state that more clearly than they can, then they won't get pulled into this in the first place. Yeah, we're going to have to.
You know, it's funny. I mean, you just gave me a dozen ideas for revisions I plan to make to my audience article, thinking about what it's like to be right at the beginning. Because I remember a friend of mine, when we were doing a writing course on, habits, you know, I'd been doing this 1,000-word a day thing for 6 years. And I remember he was our copywriter. He said, dude, you have to realize these people aren't you. He said, this is second nature to you at this point.
Yes, and I think that is another error when people write books, because they start thinking about a subject. By the time they've written a book, and it doesn't just have to be books, but you asked me about books, and by the time they have anything like a manuscript done, they've thought about that subject a great deal more than the reader, or they may well have done. And so again, the same errors can be made. You know, the presumption of where, they must understand this thing or that thing, and they don't, because they're not thinking about that all the time. So you have to sort of keep, which comes back to full circle to what we talked about at the beginning. You have to keep coming back to, where are they? And that's what that first column is for. It's like, where are people at? And that's actually, to me, that's where the subject gets exciting, because because then you're talking about something real. You're no longer talking about a concept of just an idea that someone goes, well, do I think that's true or not? You don't really want people sitting in an audience when you're teaching or reading a book going, do I think that's true? That's not really the optimal. That's fine, but it's not optimal. What you want is for someone to go, oh my goodness, that's me right now, and that is what I want. That's what you want somebody to say. Then, not is it conceptually true? Is that true for me right now? Oh yeah, I'm already in. Yes, this is true. I want to get better even, and in this next book, I want to be even better than I've been able to do it in the past. From this to this, and capture it just right.
So let's do this. As we were talking about, we were kind of getting into a framework. I think we were talking about sort of mental models and clarity, and how I think the thing that makes your book so easy to read is the fact that you really think about them, as you pointed out, in terms of mental models. And we're getting close towards the end here. So to me, I think what was so brilliant about this is, like, I guess not coincidentally, the simplicity of it, but, you kind of break this down into sort of, a couple of different actions, which are, define, start, simplify, progress, pace, and effortless results. And then, you talk about learning and automating, which that's another big one for me. But let's say, for example, somebody listening to this is planning out their day. And hands down, the number one problem that I kept coming back to over and over again when we did surveys for our email list was everybody's like, oh, I'm dealing with information overload. Like, I can't remember where the hell I put anything. But I think that when you talk about define in particular, this is really something that struck me. You say that if you want to make something hard, indeed truly impossible to complete, all you have to do is make the end goal as vague as possible. That's because you cannot, by definition, complete a project with a clearly defined endpoint. You can tinker with it, you can and likely will abandon it, but to get an important project done, it's absolutely necessary to define what done looks like. And so it made me think about some of the answers that came back in the survey data, where people's answers for what they would do if they could accomplish anything were incredibly vague. Like, I want to build a creative business that, serves humanity. Like, great. Like, that is so vague. There was some other one where, I don't remember the exact thing. I said, okay, well, there are numerous businesses that could fall into the category you're talking about. You could, have an adult film studio and it would still be in this category that this person was speaking of. So let's just, talk about this through the lens of planning a day. I think that will be a really perfect way to sort of bring everything that we've talked about here full circle. Yeah, look, I mean,
the first thing I think somebody should do if they're trying to plan a day is to create a done for the day list. We set ourselves up, and as overachievers, one of the main reasons we feel dissatisfied by the end of the day is that we don't know what done looks like for that day. So we have an endless, almost literally infinite to-do list. It is typical for people that their to-do list gets longer by the end of the day than it is at the beginning. And so you lie down at night and you're just looking at the gap and all the things that haven't been done and feel discouraged by that. Well, it's an unwinnable game. So let's make it more winnable, more sustainable, wiser by saying, what are the things I need to do today? But when I'm done with them, I can be done for the day. Now, I tend to think that the list is like a 3 to 6 item list, maybe 3 things professionally, 3 things personally. And these are the important things. You may do other things beyond this, but these are the things that when you're done with them, no more sneaky work after that. It's okay to stand aside and to then move into recuperation. So that's like one thing to do. The next rule of thumb I think would be helpful for people is to say, make sure you organize your day in a way that you don't do more today than you can completely recuperate from by tomorrow. Mm-hmm. Because as soon as you get into anything like a lifestyle of using up more than you can recuperate from today, then you're already moving quickly past your optimal state. You'll end up living, even if you've got used to it, a lifestyle of exhaustion, where your mental capacities are very clouded. Your mind feels foggy. You start to resent other people's requests for your time and so on. Yeah, this is like when you can't find your keys, you get an email from a client or a boss or something, and you just resent. They seem to be complaining about something, and your daughter asks you to braid her hair, and you resent that too. And then contrast that with if you implement even the 2 things I've just suggested, you stop the day, you eat a good meal, have a hot shower, get a good night's sleep, and then the next day you wake up, you're fully rested. You find your keys right where you left them, the email, you're like, oh, I know how to respond to this. This is no big deal. I know what they mean. You're able to respond to the needs of the people around you and welcome it. I mean, that's the difference. So if I could wrap that up in maybe a third specific thing, I would just say that we have to take rest and relaxation and treat it like it's a responsibility, so that when we're crafting this ideal day, we are actually crafting activities for rest and recuperation. That we don't just, for a lot of overachievers, they don't know how to relax. They literally don't have that competency. They're far more adept at running a marathon than they are taking a nap. And so when you're designing this day, you have to design like it's a responsibility, like it's, like relaxation. It becomes a set of rituals that you build into your day. And you do it not because you're lazy, of course, not because you don't want to achieve, but because you want to achieve at a pinnacle level for a very, very long time. You want to perform well, even superbly, for 50 years. Not for 5 days, not for 5 months, not even for 5 years. You want to be able to perform decade after decade. In fact, and I think this is a good place to sort of end it in a sense, because of this simple idea. You want to live life in crescendo, where your greatest contribution always lies ahead of you, not behind you. And if you want to live like that, then you have to design your day to day differently than you otherwise would. Yes, it's about contribution. Yes, it's about doing what really matters. And it means doing it in ways that are protecting the asset that is you, and that has boundaries, and that has place for designful rest, recuperation, and relaxing, so that you can keep on contributing and contributing for a very long time into the future. And that's really what, certainly what I want, and what I think most achievement-oriented people want once they recognize that as an option.
Yeah. Wow. Well, it's funny. This is one of the handful of times that I didn't end up quoting multiple sections of your book, but I mean, you just kind of packed this with so many nuggets that it's kind of funny. You summarized, amazingly enough, you kind of effortlessly summarized your entire book. So
you made it easy.
So I have one final question, which
Yes.
I've asked you before. It's how we finish all of our interviews. What do you think it is that makes somebody or something unmistakable?
What do I think it is that makes something unmistakable? Is that what you said?
Yes.
My answer for that today has to do with this idea of utter and total uniqueness. And it's really the idea that the more we understand who we are, the more we understand who each other are, the more distinct each person becomes. And that therefore, as you gain greater clarity in that uniqueness, each person can become more and more of who they really are, and less of who they really aren't. And so it's a complete opposite of FOMO, of just the fear of missing out, of being like everybody else, of competing and comparing, that trying to be like and do like every other strategy. You become more and more uniquely you, and therefore, and you value the uniqueness in other people distinctly, and therefore every person in this way becomes unmistakable, signature them, and that's what I think. That's what I think it means to be unmistakable.
Amazing. Well, I can't thank you for enough for taking the time to join us and sharing your story, your wisdom, and insights with our listeners. And it's just so wonderful to have you back for a second time. Where can people find out more about you, the new book, and everything else you're up to?
I think the easiest single thing people can do so they don't miss anything. I have a 1 Minute Wednesday newsletter. You can sign up for that at gregmckeown.com. So literally, we just try to make each week's letter. You can read it in 1 minute, and our goal is to make it the most valuable minute you spend online each week. So it's just tight and essentialist, and just enough to keep putting this into your life in an incremental way over time. That's probably the best single thing people could do.
Amazing. And for everybody listening, we will wrap the show with that.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Unmistakable Creative Podcast. While you were listening, were there any moments you found fascinating, inspiring, instructive, maybe even heartwarming? Can you think of anyone, a friend or a family member who would appreciate this moment? If so, take a second and share today's episode with that one person, because good ideas and messages are meant to be shared.
Does this song make your guests propose? and not only get the reply yes, but yes, boo, yes, 1,000 times yes. With Soundtrack Your Brand, you can curate playlists that work for your business.
Yes, boo, yes, 1,000 times yes!
Get 50% off your first 3 months at soundtrackyourbrand.com/50off. Soundtrack Your Brand. Your restaurant, your playlist.